Kellie Carter Jackson. She is the Michael and Denise 68 Associate Professor of Africana Studies and the Chair of the Africana Studies Department at Wellesley College. She is the author of We Refuse, A Forceful History of Black Resistance, and Force and Freedom, Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence. I absolutely love this book and really excited to dig into it with you this evening.
Yes, thank you so much for being with us. We're looking forward to this conversation. And just one more time for the book cover. It is
Yeah.
beautiful. It is fabulous. And the contents of this book are just incredible. And so we want to start by asking you about your ancestors' refusal, how you came to this concept of talking about refusal. And so in the book, you share this story of your ancestor who was denied medical care, leading to a lifelong limp. So can you talk about this story and how this personal history shaped your understanding of resistance and your interests in writing this book?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for having me. This is like such an honor. I'm just a huge fan. A lot of my fellow academic friends have done this classroom before, and it's just really special to be asked and to have people that are like invested in my work. I tell people all the time, like every author just wants to be read. That's it. We write to be read. And so it feels really good to be read. The story We Refuse actually opens up with a story about my great grandmother Arnesta. So when Arnesta was 9 years old, she stepped on a rusty nail, and we're not sure what happened. We probably think that she got tetanus, but she got a really bad infection and was almost to the point of death. And so her mother, Mary Bullard, was frantic because Arnesta was a child and she was her only child. And so she took her to the only doctor she knew, a white man who lived in a big house on the other side of town, and basically says, "Hey, will you help my daughter?" And this white doctor says, "Yeah, sure, I'll help her, on one condition, that after I do this, that she has to come and live with me and work for my family for the rest of her life." She's 9 years old. And I just can't imagine that kind of, proposal. And because it was 1915 in rural Alabama, her mother, Mary Bullard, agreed. She didn't want her daughter to die, and she thought, well, maybe this is better than death. And my great grandmother, whose name is actually lost to history, I don't know her name. We suspect it's Mary as well, but we're not sure. She picks up Arnesta and she's like, absolutely not. No way, not on my watch. We refuse. And takes her back home and gives Arnesta like every single concoction that she can come up with. I'm not exactly sure what she used, but she healed Arnesta. She saved her life. But as a result of the healing, my great grandmother walked with a limp. And so for the rest of her life, I talk about how she was like really imprinted by this violent racial act of refusal of care, refusing to care for her. And I talk about how, like, oftentimes that's what it means to be Black in America. Like, we can refuse bondage, or we can limp. And those aren't great options. You know what I mean? It's not great options to die or to be in bondage or to walk with a limp. But what I love about that story is that my great grandmother refused the metaphorical fork in the road. She carved out a space for her granddaughter to survive that had nothing to do with the doctor and had nothing to do with death or slavery. And the reason why I started with this story is because I asked my mom, why did our great grandmother walk with the limp? And so she told me this story, and it just set off a whole bunch of questions about, like, wow, if these were her options in 1915, 50 years after slavery had been abolished, these were the detestable options in front of her. Like, how might we think about our own refusal and the options that are presented before us in our own lives? Maybe not as stark or maybe not as dire, but still requiring us to refuse proposals and to refuse white supremacy. And so that's where the book started from. And I think that oftentimes in history, we talk about resistance a lot, right? But for me, resistance is the how of, fighting back against white supremacy. But refusal is the why. Refusal is a why. And I think that for me, I see refusal as not just a no, but never, like never. And And that's why it was so powerful for me to start there, to say, like, yes, resistance matters, and we're going to talk a lot about it, but we got to get to refusal first, because that's the why.
Mm, mm. I love that. I really appreciate how you wove in your family story all throughout the book to ground it in your own experience. And, my dad recently discovered which plantation our family had been enslaved on in Mississippi.
Mm,
We had a chance to go down there, and this last spring, we even met descendants of the family that enslaved our family
mm,
and had lunch with them. And
mm.
I still don't know how to describe that or what to say about it. I'm working on that, but I was
Wow.
inspired by your storytelling about your family history to think about how to explain it.
Mm,
In the introduction, you write, refusal is Black culture. It is our anthem, a mantra, a way of being, present in the novelty and genius of our vernacular, in the newspaper and the literature we create to tell our stories, in the drum, the banjo,
mhm,
and bass that permeate our music, in vocals that refuse to be timid, diluted, or replicated. It is
mm,
present also in our willingness to welcome, forgive, be hospitable, and care. We refuse to build ourselves up. I just
mm,
absolutely love the
mm.
language and the emotion and the sentiment that you put forward there. Can you explain why you titled the book We Refuse, and how you see this idea of refusal playing out in today's ongoing struggles for racial justice?
That's a good question. So I had a horrible title. At first, at first it was like Violence in Four Parts or something like that. And my friend was like, "What? That sounds like a play. What is that?" Like, and I was like, "Okay, that's not good." And even my editor was like, "We need a better title." And so I actually was on vacation and I was trying to think the whole time, like, what should I call this book? And I started thinking about refusal because I talk about refusal so much in the book, but I didn't want it to be like I refuse, and I didn't want it to just be like refuse. I wanted to sort of call back to the collective, and like we refuse is really this mantra, this idea that I think is pertinent in not just Black culture, but Native American culture and Latino culture, and like a lot of cultures of oppressed people and marginalized people, where it's like, no, we are not taking this lying down. We will fight back. And so I love the idea of refusal because it's not a polite no, it's not a please. Like when you refuse something, you are emphatic. Like it is not, there no like politeness and well manners about it. And I think that sometimes when we talk about like white supremacy and we talk about combating it, sometimes I've gotten really frustrated. And that's kind of where the origins of this book came, because I feel like we talk about non-resistance as like, or are you going to be like violent or non-violent? Like these are the options in front of you. Are you going to be like Malcolm X? Is it going to be by any means necessary, or is it going to be like MLK? And are you going to march? And are you going to protest? But are you going to be non-violent? That's always when it comes back to. And I just wanted to have a much more expansive way of thinking about Black resistance. And if Gen Z has taught me anything, it's that binaries do not serve us very well, that these dichotomies, these limited boxes that we put ourselves in of violence or nonviolence does not explore the fullness of Black resistance. We are not just throwing Molotov cocktails or forgiving people when they harm us. That's not the those are
Mm,
not the options. And so by looking at refusal, I get to look at a lot of different things. The book's made up of 5 chapters. It's like revolution, force, protection, flight, and joy. And this is not an exhaustive list. I feel like I could have added more chapters if I had time, but I wanted to look at all of the different ways that Black people refused. And that refusal looks so different. It looks different for the individual as it does for the collective. It looks one way for women and Black mothers than it does for Black men. But I thought it was just so important to sort of encapsulate that because, I don't know if you guys saw like in 2020, there were all these memes, like trash memes going around, like, be careful, I'm not my ancestor. And I was like, what is that
mm.
garbage? Like, do you not know your history? Do you not know that Black history is
Thank
a
you.
history of refusal? We've been doing this for centuries. Like, what you are doing is not new. And so, as a historian, I like to tell people stories. That is how history is my weapon. It's my way of talking about how people have refused.
Beautiful.
Wow, that's so powerful. And I love the intentionality behind the language, right? All of the iterations of the book title and coming to refusal. It makes me think about one of my mentors, David Johns. He always told me that no is a full sentence, period, full
Yes.
stop.
Yes, I love David
That's what
Johns.
I think
Yes.
of when you're talking about refusal. I love
Yeah.
that. And so you talked about the different sections of your book. So we wanted to talk a little bit about revolution.
Mm.
Right now, this question I think is really pertinent given the conversations happening online in light of the presidential election and the debate. And it's so important that we lift up Haiti. So you
Yeah.
describe in the book the Haitian Revolution as a radical reimagining of what freedom could be, a world
Mhm.
without slavery, a world where the oppressed could claim their humanity. And so you also contrast the Haitian Revolution to what's called the American Revolution,
Mhm.
arguing that it should be more accurately described as the American War for Independence. So, can you talk a little bit about that distinction,
Yeah.
especially for the teachers on the call, and talk about what the Haitian Revolution teaches us about the potential for revolutions to create systemic change rather than just incremental project progress?
Absolutely. I mean, this may sound like fighting words, but like the American Revolution was not revolutionary. Like it just was not. Nothing changes for Native Americans. Life is worse. Nothing changes for Black people. Life gets worse. Slavery persists for another 100 years after 1776. Nothing gets better for women. Nothing gets better, really better for poor white people either. Like, it's not revolutionary. What it does is it replaces like a foreign leader with a local one. But for the most part, a lot of those power structures are still in place. And so when I think of a revolution for me, it's not just like this like apocalyptic, we ride at dawn, like this very like scary thing. It is like replacing a broken system, a bad system with a better one, with a just one. And so when I think of revolutions, to me, you can't talk about a revolution without the abolition of slavery. So
Mm.
America has its revolution, but it doesn't free its enslaved. France has its revolution. It does not free its enslaved. Haiti is the only one that says, yes, we're going to overthrow a colonial power and we're going to abolish the institution of slavery. And not only that, but like when you think about the revolution that takes place in Latin America, when Simon Bolivar is popping off his revolution, he goes to Haiti and it's like, hey, I need help. And they're like, okay, we'll help you. We'll give you guns. We'll give you soldiers on one condition, that you abolish slavery throughout all of Latin America. Like, South America has Haiti to thank for its freedom in a lot of ways. And so we don't talk about like how liberation should liberate other people, that it shouldn't just be something that is like for one group of a select people, the gens de couleur in Haiti is the mixed race people that were sort of privileged, but for everyone. And so Haiti to me is just, it's the starting point for a lot of places. I think we don't talk about Haiti enough. And part of that is because racism, anti-Blackness. Like that's the short answer is anti-Blackness, and a refusal to see that like this small island nation, smaller than the state of Vermont, more mountainous than the state of Vermont, managed to overthrow a European power and do what the other European powers could not: abolish slavery, not have to subsist off of enslaved labor. That to me is just everything. And so I write about Haiti. I also write about Guadeloupe, this small island that was also part of France that does get freedom and then gets re-enslaved again and then gets freedom later, like what these delays look like. But in the American context, I think it's important to say that like revolution does come to America. But one of the arguments I make is that if America was conceived in 1776, it wasn't born until 1865. I really see like the birth of America as the conclusion of the Civil War. So when you think about like what happens after 1865, you have not just war, you have the abolition of slavery, you have the granting of citizenship with the 14th Amendment, you have the granting of suffrage with the 15th Amendment for Black men, Reconstruction brings the first universal education system. We all have public education because of Reconstruction. We all have the first public health departments because of Reconstruction, because so many people died in the Civil War and there were so many diseases that it was important for the country to have its own first public health departments and sanitation departments. There's so much that comes out of Reconstruction that is revolutionary. Like, not all Black people, some Black people get land, some do, they get it taken away. That's another story. But like, there are revolutionary things that are happening. There are over 1,500 Black elected officials in Reconstruction. Like, that's insane to me. Nowhere else other than Haiti do you get an enslaved person who's now serving as a US senator or a congressman within less than a generation. You know, that to me, someone like Robert Smalls, who's a Black man who's enslaved in South Carolina and then gets his freedom and then goes on to serve in Congress, that hasn't happened anywhere else. That's revolutionary. So yeah, we do have a revolution in America, but the hardest part of getting a revolution is sustaining it. That is the hardest part. Haiti has had the hardest time sustaining its victory. Black people in America have had the hardest time sustaining their victory. And I think that's because a lot of times we think that revolution is the ending point. No, it's the starting point. It's where you start. Like, that's where the story begins. You can't, like, okay, revolution, we won. That's it. Like, no, this is the beginning of our work, and that work is ongoing and really never ending, because the moment you sort of take your foot off the gas in terms of liberation, well, then that's injustice is right around the corner.
No doubt. No doubt. Oh, wonderful lessons you drew out of that. And, we're seeing it again today with US imperialism attacking Haiti
Mm-hmm.
and the instability that they just chalk up to Haiti being poor, and
Mm-hmm.
instead of understanding the way that the US built blockades against Haiti and
Yep.
helped impoverish the country. So
Mm-hmm.
this is where knowing something about history is so important, and you just
Mm.
break it all down in the book. Uh, and in the chapter you titled Protection, I love this chapter, and I learned something brand new that I'd never heard of before that I really appreciated. You discussed the Lancaster Black Self-Protection Society that I hadn't
Yes.
heard of and was really inspiring. You highlight the essential role that Black women played in organizing and leading efforts to protect their communities. Um, and I've been studying more and more the role of Black women in both armed self-defense and all kinds of uh, areas, but I hadn't come across this story before, so it was
Yeah.
great. And this was just fascinating history that was kept from me in my schooling, and I was hoping you could talk more about the Lancaster Black Self-Protection Society and how you see the
Yeah.
broader historical role of Black women in armed resistance.
First, I love the word that they're using the word Black in the 19th century, the Black
Yeah.
Self-Protection Society. It's just like amazing. This story is one of my favorite stories to tell. It's actually a story I also talk about in my first book, Force and Freedom, too. Um, where basically, I'm gonna try to keep it short because I don't want to have too many long answers, but like basically William and Eliza Parker are Black, they are fugitives, they are living in Christiana, Pennsylvania, which is right on the border of Maryland, the slave state of Maryland and the free state of Pennsylvania. And they make their house sort of like a depot on the Underground Railroad, a stop where if you need to get supplies to keep going further north, they will protect you, they will hide you, they will do whatever they can, even at the risk of their own lives. Like, that was part of the mantra of their group, that we will protect fugitive slaves even at the risk of our own lives. And so they had this reputation that if you got to their home, you could be protected, and everyone in that community would work to protect you. And so four enslaved men escape Maryland, and they wind up going to Christiana. They go straight to the Parker's home, where William and Harriet Parker basically say, come on in, we'll hide you in the attic, and we'll help you get further north. Well, because of the Parker's reputation, it's a matter of hours before the enslaver, Edward Gorsuch, his son, his nephew, a U.S. Marshal, I think maybe one other person, show up at the Parker's home and basically bam on the door and say like, we know you've got our enslaved property, we want them back. I'm paraphrasing a lot of this, but but that's essentially what happens. And then William Parker comes to the door and he's like, over my dead body. That's not happening. You're not getting these men back. And then Eliza goes up to the roof and basically is like, babe, you want me to sound the alarm? I will sound the alarm. And she starts blowing this horn for the Lancaster Black Self-Protection Society, the horn that would alert everybody that like danger is here, come to our house, meet us, help us out. The men who are outside start shooting at the window. Thankfully, they live in a stone house. So she's hiding under the window, but still blowing the horn while hiding under the window. Within minutes, like 80 men and women, white and black, show up with rifles, pistols, pitchforks, farm equipment, like ready to protect these 4 enslaved men. And it's just crazy because like Eliza's brother-in-law is panicking. He's like, no, just give them up, give them up. And Eliza is like, she picks up a corn cutter, which is like a machete. And she basically says, I will chop off the first member of our group that tries, I will chop off the head of the first member of our group that tries to give these people up. Like this machete is not just for enslavers. This machete is for snitches, right? Like snitches get stitches. Like, I feel like that's what she says. And okay, so long story short, all of a sudden shots are fired. We don't know who fires the first shot. An altercation ensues. Edward Gorsuch is laying on the ground dying. His son gets shot and takes off. The nephew and the U.S. Marshal, they see they're outnumbered. They take off. It's wild. It's wild. And what's crazy is that William Parker writes about this in his narrative, and he says Edward Gorsuch lay on the ground dying. And then he says, and the women put an end to him. The women put an end to him. And I was like, oh, like, as I'm in the archive, like reading these things, I'm like, what? Like, did they slit his throat? Did they snuff him out? Like, what did they do? I don't know. But all I know is that this tells me a lot of things, that women were very much engaged in violent resistance, that women were not timid and unafraid. They were not the damsel in distress. They were the ones that were sounding the alarm, picking up corn cutters, and ready to take out the master as he lay on the ground dying. And so it's just, for me, this story is like the pinnacle of protection. You know, they don't know these 4 enslaved men, but they help them anyways, and they manage to escape. They get all the way to Rochester, New York. They stay in Frederick Douglass's home. Frederick Douglass writes about this in his narrative. He's like, yeah, I saw these men, I saw William Parker, and I helped them get on a boat to Canada. And as they're getting on a boat, William Parker's like, hey, Freddie Doug, I got a gift for you. I want to give you a token, a memento of the Battle of Christiana. And he gives him the pistol that fell out of Edward Gorsuch's hand. And it's like, dang, like it just, to me, that whole thing. I mean, the abolitionists were gangster. They were gangster. And like, they knew what they were up against was life or death. And I love
Hmm.
that story. I'm sorry, that took too long, but like, if it makes
I
you want to
love
read the
that
book,
story. Love that
there's more
story.
to it. There's more that happens. There's plot twists, but yeah, it's a lot.
Everyone's got to read the book and get that story. I told you I was down in Mississippi last June, and I got to interview someone that knew my enslaved great-great-grandmother, and she talked about surviving during Jim Crow. They burnt down the daycare center in their town, trying to drive everyone out of the town, all the black people out of the town. And they armed themselves, resisted, fought back, and were able. They reopened the daycare center in a tent, but
Wow.
they didn't end it. And it just that story just made me think of
They
how much
refused.
they
They
were.
refused.
Yes.
Mm.
Yes. Oh, this is so powerful. I don't know about everybody else, but I was on the edge of my seat for that story. I was sat for that story. And as we're talking about force, as we're talking about this refusal through resistance and protection of community of self, in your book, you state that Black people have always used force, not to
Mhm.
oppress, but to protect, defend, and liberate themselves. So, how do you
Mhm.
see this distinction between using force for liberation versus oppression? And how does that
Mm.
out in both historical and contemporary resistance movements?
Yeah, another good question. Force and the way I define it is really about arresting violence. It's not about committing acts of violence. It is about compelling forcefully to get someone to stop. And I think that's really an important distinction that when we're talking about, but really is like armed self-defense, protective self-defense, that we don't interrogate white violence enough, that so much of the gaze is put on Black response. Are they going to be violent? Are they terrifying? Do they have guns? Do they have, weapons? And we never talk about the fact that like white supremacy is violent. It is violent. It is so violent that we have story upon story upon story of Black people trying to resist it. And I push on this a lot because I feel like, when we talk about violence, it's really not a two-way street. It just isn't. We don't have stories in which four little white girls are killed while worshiping in their church. We don't have stories in which white men are assassinated in their driveway in front of their family, like Medgar Evers. We don't have stories where 14-year-old white boys are killed while visiting the North in a Black community, like Emmett Till was in the reverse. We don't have these stories of Black people going to white churches and being welcomed by white churches and then proceeding to shoot up the entire church, like Dylan Ruth did in South Carolina. There is no Black corollary for that. And I think that's so important to harp on because oftentimes we think about Black violence and we think that Black people want revenge for slavery or they want revenge for Jim Crow. And I say in the book, no, revenge is a white imaginary project. White people are obsessed with revenge. Black people are not. Black people don't want revenge. They want justice, and justice is much more costly than revenge. It is much more costly, but most Black people just want to live their lives. Most Black people don't want to be a hashtag or a statistic. And so the ways that they've had to do that oftentimes is to take up force when nothing else will work. And to me, it was important to talk about the ways that armed resistance was successful, because I think that a lot of times we think that Black people who use guns or take up guns are somehow bad faith actors. And nothing could really be further of the truth. There's stories after stories of Black people who really don't shoot white people, but just have the gun, and the gun is enough to like scare away, the Klan or whoever is trying to terrorize them. There's stories where, Ida B. Wells talks about the importance of having a gun. Rosa Parks talks about her kitchen table being covered in guns during the Montgomery bus boycott. I myself learned about my grandmother who was packing heat and carried a gun, on her. These stories, I think, are stories in which Black people are asserting their own rights to protect themselves. So it's never about causing harm. It's always about stopping harm. Even if you look at the Black Panther Party, I think this is really important. Like, the Black Panther Party starts out using guns and as a way to sort of assert themselves and protect other Black people in their community from police brutality. They have this whole cop watch thing. But I also think that really the bedrock of the Black Panther Party was not really force, it was protection. And within a year, they actually decide, you know what, guns are backfiring, no pun intended. They're not really helpful to us. What is going to help us more is feeding our community, is educating our community, is making sure that our children have something to eat and that our people are well cared for. And I think the federal government, if they were honest with themselves, was more afraid of a well-fed, well-educated Black child than they were a Black man with a gun. Like, that is why the Black Panther Party gets shut down, not because of guns. That breakfast program that spread across the country, the literacy programs that they had, the grocery programs that they had, the prison programs that they had, the public health programs that they had, they're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. They're giving them things that the government should actually be doing, and it terrified people in the FBI. But for me, I saw what the Panther Party was doing as a form of not just force, but also an extension of protection. And so it's important to sort of distinguish those two a little bit. Like I talk a lot about guns. I talk about Daisy Bates and the Little Rock Nine and how she used a gun. But she doesn't, again, she doesn't kill anybody. She fires off some warning shots, and that's enough to like scare away, the Klan or whoever these white people are. But at the end of the day, you know, this is gonna sound bad, but it is what it is. At the end of the day, a lot of white people are cowards, and that when their own life is on the line, they stop those shenanigans. Like when somebody armed shows up, like, oh, you want to go toe to toe? You come in for my house? Like you want to play these games? Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Like I feel like that is how a lot of Black people engaged. And when white people saw that, oh snap, these Black people are going to fight back, a lot of that racial violence stopped. There are actually stories where riots in Black communities actually get quelled, actually stop, because there's a Black armed presence in that community, and the white folks know it.
Mm. Wow. Thank you for keeping it real, for teaching us all this history. This has been an amazing start to the conversation. But I wanted to get back to Dr. Jackson and ask about, in your chapter called Fight, you write that, quote, fight is one of the most common actions in the history of Black resistance. It can mean quitting a job or a place. It can be short term or permanent. So I was hoping you could, I love this framing of how you talk about what fight is, and I was hoping you could talk about fight as resistance, especially in the way you reframe the Great Migration as
Yeah.
a mass
Like,
refusal to accept the terror of Jim Crow and viewing that as a political act.
yeah, flight is probably one of the most, I would say, popular. I don't know if I can use the word popular, widely used forms of resistance. I've seen it definitely in my own family. I'm a product of the Great Migration. My family they all hail from Louisiana and Mississippi, and they all migrated up to Detroit and Chicago during the automotive boom. And I've thought about flight in this current election because people are always like, listen, if it goes sideways, we going to Canada, we going to Ghana, where are we going? Like, Black people are always thinking about like where we're off to. I even think about flight in terms of like when the automotive industry in Detroit started to fade. A lot of my family members left Detroit and they went back to the South. They went to Houston, they went to Atlanta. Um, and so we see flight at the end of the American Revolution. We see flight during the Civil War, Black people leaving plantations. We see flight during the Black Panther Party. A lot of Black Panthers, went to Tanzania or went to Algeria. So flight is common. What I think is problematic about flight, though, is that it's probably the least effective of all of the remedies or the tools that I talk about. And I say that because it's so individualistic, meaning I can leave, but can we leave? It's when I think about we refuse, I think about the collective. And when you think about the fact that anti-Blackness is global, that there's really no place in the world that you can go where there's not either white supremacy or anti-Blackness, it means that you really have to do the work right where you are. Um, and so oftentimes while talking about flight, I talk about truancy because truancy is maybe leaving for a short period of time and then coming back. It's what a lot of enslaved people did. Maybe they couldn't leave Georgia and get to Boston, but they could go out to the woods or to the swamp for 2 weeks and they could rob the slaveholder of their labor, of their bodies for that short amount of time, and it would give them a reprieve. They would leave and maybe go to another plantation, maybe visit a loved one, like Frederick Douglass's mother did. She would leave and walk 12 miles just to sleep a few hours with her son when Frederick Douglass was a child, and then walk 12 miles back to her plantation before the sun came up. I tell this story not in the book, but in another book in which there's a woman that ran away from her plantation. And when she got captured, she was sent back to the plantation. And as a form of punishment, they put her inside of a wheelbarrow that was hammered with nails, and they rolled her in it. And I was like, oh my gosh. And she says, when she gets out of the wheelbarrow, she says, wasn't until 2 weeks later until I ran again. I could not stay there. And I thought about it's a great title of a article written by Stephanie Camp called "I Could Not Stay There," about how even when you know that the consequences are dire or death, Black people refuse to stay in their subjugation. And so flight is one of the ways that Black people manifest that. But flight's also limited because, outside of the United States, there's not one single country in the world that can come to the United States without a visa. Not one single Black country that can do like you could do if you were in Germany or Italy and say, I want to go on holiday. I want to go to New York City. Like, let me just book a ticket and go. You can't do that if you live in Ghana. You can't do that if you live in Jamaica. We have really racist policies that limit Black mobility all over the world. And so it's worth talking about. So that's why I put it in the chapter. But I'm clear to talk about its limitations too.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. We appreciate hearing about how Black folks have used flight as a form of resistance and refusal. And so for the next question, we want to talk about the chapter on joy. I saw joy come up in the chat. Jesse and I were talking about this. We're so excited. I'm a dance teacher. Jesse's a musician.
Yay!
And
Yay!
so we were reading this chapter. We were like, oh, yes, we love to hear it. And so you write that joy is its own form of resistance, and that joy is pride that can be expressed with swaying hips, stomping feet, and jolts of back arching dance moves. And so, in what way are dancing, singing, loving acts of defiance? How can educators
Mm.
teach about and create space for Black joy?
Ah, joy is a weapon, y'all. Joy is a weapon. It is how we fortify ourselves. It is how we protect ourselves. It is how we enact our humanity. I can't think of a Black experience that does not include or strive for joy. Even in the most difficult, violent, you think about the institution of slavery, and I think, yes, there were times when enslaved people laughed, when they danced, when they enjoyed a good meal. Like there were time, and I'm not saying that to belittle slavery to say that, oh, it wasn't that bad. I'm so showing that to say that Black people always carved out spaces to assert their humanity, and joy is a part of that. So I talk about it a lot in the book. I talk about how I cultivate joy with my children. It says there's a quote by Ashley Simpo that says, "Some of us fight racism by teaching our Black children to know joy. This matters too." And joy can be so superficial. Like at the end of the book, I close talking about my daughter and how my daughter has the most infectious laugh. Like I don't need to know what she's laughing about. If I hear her laughing, I'm cracking up because I just love her laugh. And how she like recorded herself singing, and this singing was so terrible. Like she was like way off key. She's like screaming out the note. And we're listening to this recording together and we are hollering with laughter. And, I thought about that and I was like, well, what does this moment have to do with white supremacy? And I'm like, nothing. That's the point. That's the whole point. Like, so whether it is, dancing or sharing a good meal or coming up with a hilarious meme like we did for the Montgomery Brawl, like the Montgomery Brawl was all about joy. Do you know what I mean? It was all about laughter and creating these moments of levity and pointing out the absurdity and the ridiculousness of racism. We see it in our protests when in 2020, when like people would be marching and then all of a sudden somebody would play RIP, Frankie Beverly Mays. And you're like, wait a second, it's a party. And like the next thing you know, um, people are dancing to Before I Let You Go or Joy and Pain. And like that is not, Imani Perry says this as well, that is not Black people making light or being superficial of their trauma. It's a way of them insisting on their humanity. We dance, we laugh, we sing, we eat, we love to insist on our humanity. And that's why joy is so important. You can't just have anger, you need joy too. And you can't just have joy because there are reasons to be angry. And so we need a healthy balance of both.
Mm. Yes, we are equipped for the struggle now with all of that wisdom. We really appreciate you highlighting that. Uh, and people have to read to the end to get the chapter on joy, and I hope you all
Yeah.
will.
I could do a whole book on joy, y'all. Watch out. I might do a whole
All
book
right.
on joy.
Good idea. Good idea. And I know Sierra's working on a book about dance and arts
Mm,
uh and all kinds of forms of artistic expression with pedagogy, and I'm excited about that project too, Sierra.
I love it. Can I just say one? I'm going to keep this quick, but I think it's so
Yeah.
important as teachers and educators, something I started doing maybe a few years ago, especially because I teach a lot of courses on slavery and the civil rights movement and a lot of stuff that's just like doom and gloom and trauma. And I said I wasn't going to teach a class anymore where we didn't dedicate like a whole week to joy, whether that was like how the enslaved created their own dance parties out in the woods, which they did, like how Black people in the South, created their own like safe houses and places where they could go to like share a good meal or eat, how Black people created knitting circles just for their own like wellness and enjoyment. Like, I think it's so important to like highlight music and theater and sports, whatever it is that brings people joy that you can use as a counterbalance. I think is so important because our students, they want to be empowered too, and they
Mhm.
don't want to feel like they're taking a class that shows Blackness as a problem. They want to have pride, and so including that joy is about instilling pride in Black culture.
I love it. And the right wing always says that what we're doing is making victims. We're just teaching Black children to be victims. And it's a
Mm,
foul lie because we're teaching them how to be empowered, how the history of resistance. But we're also teaching them that joy, right? And how to be
mhm,
joyful
mhm,
in your Black skin. And so this puts lie to everything the right wing is saying about what anti-racist pedagogy looks like. And I wanted to just
mhm,
finish up with a question about that, this attack that's
mhm,
happening on anti-racist education. You write in the book, quote, educating Black children has always been a political act. From the moment literacy was banned for enslaved people, the work of getting Black children education could be met with danger and even deadly force by white supremacists who wanted a subjugated Black class. And this history is
mm,
clearly repeating itself, particularly important that we study now in light of laws that are banning anti-racist education and the teaching of honest history. So what lessons from past struggles for Black education can we apply in this current moment to build fights to end these laws and to win Black studies and ethnic studies?
mm, I feel like it is a all hands on deck approach, and we need everything that I talked about in the book. We need revolution, we need protection, we need force, we need flight, we need joy. We need spaces where we have our own classrooms, where we educate our children in ways that our public schools will not. There was a lot of that, freedom schools and literacy schools during segregation and Jim Crow. We need spaces where we can retreat and leave to and feel safe in and be away from the white gaze. That's important too. We need also like grassroots workers and activists and people that are going to be like, oh, hell no. And march and protest and demand policy changes and say, no, this does not work for our school district. This does not work for our community. We need collective refusal. I think that's so important. I am not resigned in this moment. I'm not just sort of like, oh, well, they made another law. Guess can't do anything about it. Like, we make the laws. We are the law. Like, and I think being able to like push back on that and say, no. And to me, that's going to take on a lot of different variations. Like I tell people, this book is not like not a how-to guide. It's not, we're not going to solve racism in 3 parts. Like, that's not what this is. But it is a way to encourage more conversation, to think about the myriad of ways, not just the 5 that I offer, but the multiple ways we can engage and combat white supremacy at an individual level, at a collective level, in our home, in our schools, in our spiritual places of worship, like at the local level, at the national level, at the global level. I want people to be doing this work, engaged in this work. And it doesn't mean that you have to put your body on the line, but it does mean that you have to be willing to engage and willing to make sacrifices and willing to ask the hard questions and different questions. It's necessary work.
Mm. Well, you've really filled my heart tonight. I know Sierra too. This
Thank
is
you. Thank you. Same here. Likewise. We need each other.
no doubt.
We need each other. It's
This is
good. Solidarity.
collective action right now, no doubt.
Yeah, yeah.